Good afternoon, everyone, and happy National Economic Development Week. Welcome to our free webinar this afternoon on National Economic Development Week from Washington. A few housekeeping notes before our welcoming remarks. First of all, you can ask questions throughout the webinar by using the chat box in the dashboard on your screen. You don't have to wait until the end, but we will take questions at the end of the webinar. Also, the webinar presentation will be made available for download at the conclusion of the webinar. We will send out a survey email. When you complete the survey, there will be a link, and you can you can download the webinar at that time. At this time, I would like to welcome Tracy McDaniel, founder and CEO of McDaniel Strategy Ecosystems, and the 2018 Vice Chair of IEDC's Board of Directors. Tracy.
Thanks, Matt. Well, welcome everyone to our National Economic Development Week from Washington webinar. We're excited to have you here with us today during our third annual celebration of the practice and the professional in economic development. Today, we will take a look at what is happening in Washington, D.C. as Congress and the Trump administration chart a course for our common economic future. There is no doubt that we're living in interesting times. Each day brings a new policy direction, a new hurdle to be overcome, and a new challenge to be met. IEDC has been at the forefront of this debate, defending a robust federal role in local economic development. And we have much to celebrate in this area. Discretionary spending saw an average increase of around 11% in the current fiscal year. EDA received nearly $1 billion in funding in this year alone. This amount includes roughly $600 million in disaster recovery money being used in over 908 disaster impact counties across the United States right now. But the news isn't all good, and it isn't all bad either. As with most things in Washington, we need a translator to help us decipher what's really happening and how it impacts all of us. Today, we have the best translator around, Jeff Finkel, our president and CEO of IEDC. Jeff will take us through budgets, key legislation, maybe some election talk, and of course, the latest in Washington. He'll also be sharing an update to a very popular resource, version 2.0 of Why Invest in Economic Development brochure. The Blue Book, as we call it, was spread by economic developers far and wide, and we have already seen a positive return on this. Washington is beginning to connect our work with dozens of key agencies and programs. The new version, which you can download now on IEDC's website under the About tab, includes more data points and updated outlooks for each agency. Be sure to download it before your next fly-in, send links to your contacts in Washington, and pick up a copy or two during our next IEDC conference. With that said, I'd like to turn it over to Jeff for today's presentation.
Thanks, Tracy. So Tracy and I were together a couple weeks ago in Austin. It's awesome to hear her voice, but you know, I feel like she's just around the corner. So let's talk about what we're going to try to get through today. Taxes and budgets and appropriations. It's kind of like lions and tigers and bears. Oh my! And we'll talk about that. We'll talk about rescissions, and that's a word that we will unfortunately add to our lexicon over the next several weeks. Hopefully we'll lose from our lexicon as well as quickly as possible. Talk about infrastructure, because that is maybe one unifying thing that people here in Washington agree upon. Trade and economic development, the coming elections, and then why invest in economic development 2.0, which Tracy just talked about. So let's talk about what has occurred. So we did have a major tax overhaul, 1.5 trillion tax cut, decreased the corporate rate from 35% to 21%. extended new markets, reserve tax exemption for municipal bonds, and created opportunity zones. Now, I think the debate that will rage from now into the foreseeable future is, does this tax break actually pay for itself? And between this and the omnibus that was passed shortly thereafter, have we put ourselves on a path to higher, more debt and higher deficits in the future? I think in the short run, we're going to get some stimulus out of the expenditure of federal dollars and the tax break. But I think that this may be a situation where at some point in the future, interest rates might start to go up, and we're going to say that maybe we went a little too far, both in tax cuts and the omnibus, and there's going to be a day when we're going to have to pay the piper. The budget deal was signed in early February, and it included $300 billion in additional budget authority. Why did they do this? And at the end of the day, they were having a difficult time balancing in order to get enough votes. They were having a difficult time meeting the needs of the people who thought we needed to have more military spending, and to get enough Democrat votes who would have been more interested in not losing some of the domestic spending that would help economic development, community development, health services, education and labor issues. And so they did this additional budget authority, which combined with the tax cuts has amounted to a lot of, as I referred to, stimulus. In the budget resolution, it included $90 billion in additional disaster recovery funding. When you look at the disasters that occurred in Texas, Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, Florida, Northern California, and any other declared federal disaster across the country, there is actually a fair amount of money on the table to help resolve that. $28 billion for the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program, $600 million in EDA. There will be infrastructure money. There is a fair amount of money for FEMA, et cetera, in that. In terms of appropriations, there was an increase in funding from previous years. EDA had been running around $270, $280 million a year. It has $300 million. The difference there is basically coal money, in that there is a number of communities that were reliant on coal as a job producer. And as a result of the price of natural gas in many places in the country, coal has become a fuel that has too much expense, and it also has some greater environmental concerns. So many companies, particularly utility companies, have been switching to natural gas. Many manufacturers have been switching to natural gas. As a result, some of these places in the Dakotas, in the Wyomings, Montana, the Appalachian states that are reliant on coal jobs are losing those jobs. And so the Economic Development Administration's been handed some money to assist those communities. In addition, we will see a number of power plants close down that were coal reliant, and some of that money can be used there as well. CDBG was running under $3 billion in annual appropriation, and it is back to $3.3 billion. And I say back, I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary at HUD for the block grant program in 1985 and 1986, and that is approximately what the appropriation was at that time. Now, there are two problems with this number. 31 or 32 years later, you're going to be losing against inflation. Second, our population has increased during that time, so you're using the same amount of money under a broader swath of people. And third, and I'm not exactly sure of this, but when I was at HUD, we used to not kick communities out of the program when they would lose population. So if you had the 50,000 urban threshold, once you went under 50,000, you were grandfathered in, and my guess is that is also hurting this. Second, Tiger program, now called BUILD, was appropriated at 1.5 billion, and the apprenticeships program at the Department of Labor is at 145 million, up 50 million from where it was before. So what has changed for 2019? So remember that $300 billion number, that was for 18 and 19. So there is a greater ceiling for 2019. Now, I would tell you that there was a backlash, political backlash, particularly from the right, on the 2018 numbers, and we'll talk about prospective rescissions in a couple minutes. So the question is, do the appropriators go ahead and spend the full $300 billion, knowing full well that that the president came out against the omnibus late in the process, and that the number two, Kevin McCarthy, also kind of stirred the president up. He's the number two in the House, and he convinced the president that they had gone a step too far. So, but we have new leadership in the Senate Appropriations Committee because of the longstanding retirement of our senator from Mississippi. The subcommittees are starting to move bills. There's no budget resolution. But these midterm elections, it'll be interesting to see what happens. And I can see 3, possibly 4 scenarios here. Scenario 1 is everybody bites their tongue. They spend the $300 billion in additional, and they finish everything by September 30th as they go into the midterm elections. In some ways, that's probably the safest way. Now, will the Tea Party movement, the right wing of the Republican Party allow that? I don't know the answer to that. If not, there will be a couple scenarios that can be considered there. One, they do continuing resolutions for a period of time, but the continuing resolution of where we are is at the same number level that they would be dealing with in the future. They could decide that they cannot pass, or we have some type of major dust up that causes them to go to a smaller number at some point. I would think that the political leadership, particularly on the Republican side on the House and Senate, wants to get a deal. They want to get a deal by September 30th so they can vote, show the voting public that they can control the Congress and operate in a sensible and manageable way. And my sensible and manageable does not necessarily mean spend all you got, but come to some resolution where everybody goes forward. Now, so I talked about McCarthy and the president, and there was a dust up at the end of that last process, and the president talked about vetoing the last omnibus bill that came before him. He ultimately signed the bill, And there were probably two reasons for that. One, there have been a lot of promises made from one side of the Senate to the other, from one side of the House to the other, and his staff had been in negotiations with everybody. And so I think ultimately he ended up holding his nose and signing it. Immediately thereafter, he said nobody should ever expect him to sign a bill like that would come before him again. And now we are hearing they want to request rescissions of what he agreed to or signed. Early on, we heard that they wanted to rescind about $60 billion in funds. We now, from some articles that are starting to come out this week, they want to rescind about $15.4 billion in the from appropriations that came before. Now, some of it has very old money. Some of it is not consistent with what OMB and the president actually want to do. And some of it they are calling ineffective, duplicative, or otherwise bad. And let's make sure that those are not necessarily IEDC words. Those are words that is coming out of the administration. Should we be worried? So some of these are things that our members rely upon. USDA includes about $130 million in rescissions from the Rural Housing Service, the Rural Utility Service, the Rural Cooperative Business Service. It includes $30 million from EDA. And as Matt Mullen on our staff reminded me yesterday, rescissions are normal business in that agencies do turn some money back from time to time. And there was $10 million in rescissions from EDA. 30 million would be on the high side and not typical. So that is what I would think is cutting into muscle. It's not taking fat. Other rescissions, $4 billion from the Advanced Vehicle Manufacturing Loan Program, $23 million from the Department of Labor National Emergency Grants. In addition, a fair amount of money from the Federal Highway Authority, the Federal Railway Authority, the Federal Transit Authority, and it must be doubly important since we put $2 marks, $174 million from CDFI. Now, what will the Senate and the House do? I think, as Matt and I talked, the House well may pass it. They will say that they went too far. There's probably enough votes to maybe barely pass it, but they will say that they probably ought to do some rescissions. That will appease their right flank. But there was a lot of work in the Senate in particular where people agreed on both sides to move the thing forward. Are they willing to break all the bonds that it took to get this omnibus passed? And my guess is probably not. And so I had some email communication with a Hill staffer yesterday who is thinking about an EDA reauthorization and gave us a draft approach to EDA reauthorization, and he thought it was unlikely. Now, is his tea reading any better than any of the rest of ours? I'm not sure we know at this point. So as I indicated as I started into this, everybody wants to build infrastructure, and we remember that the president, as he was running for office, talked about, I believe, $1 trillion program, and I think it would be fair to characterize it was $1 trillion in federal spending with public-private partnerships over and above that. It is now changing, and I think he's realizing the limitations on how grand this federal budget is and how much you can spend without wrecking lots of other programs. So they do have a $1.2 trillion plan, $200 billion in direct spending over 10 years. They're trying to create some state and local public-private investments. And there's not a lot of there yet. So we'll have to see how that comes out over time. Matt Mullen, who I've talked about on the IDC staff, thinks this may be one of those things that in a lame duck session after the election, there may be some compromise, some advancement of an infrastructure program where both parties agree on some level of spending and some advancement of this. The Senate Democrats released their own proposal. It is $1 trillion in federal direct spending. It would create a lot of jobs. It would it would be paid for through changes to corporate and individual tax rates. Here we're going back to probably a somewhat undoing of the recently passed tax bill, which probably makes it DOA. Certainly would make it DOA, I think, on behalf of the president. And I can't imagine that there would be a great taste in the mouth of the Senate Republicans or the House Republicans, since one of their grandest activities so far has been the passage of the relatively new tax cut. So what's the problem? Nobody knows where the money's going to come from. And how can you actually get to yes, and how do you actually move forward on that? So trade and economic development. There's been a lot of conversation on this. So NAFTA has been in the news. The president hasn't been wild about NAFTA. He's made that clear. They have had a number of negotiations between Canada and Mexico and the United States. I think they thought they would have this resolved by now. It is not, and it's unclear to me where we're going to get on that. We have added a session at the annual conference in Atlanta to help talk about this. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, is dead. It's not dead it's not dead for the other partners of TPP. It's just dead to us. And now that it's dead, I'm starting to hear some that the administration would like to figure out how they can get back in only under their terms. So, does it move to a series of bilateral agreements? Do they get back into it? But I think they're starting to feel or hear the negative effects from having pulled out of the TPP. More to come on that. Tariffs. So, there has been a fair amount of conversations about tariffs. Who are we going to enforce tariffs against, or what are we going to do with China? What are we doing with steel and aluminum? Are there going to be other tariffs that we're going to cause to come about, and what is the impact of those are going to be? Or are these negotiating steps? I think there's you can say you're going to do it, and then you hope you can bring people together to a negotiating table and move in a slightly different direction. But you got to remember, people are not going to give up their home court advantage if they think that they have an advantage at this point. What is the advantage of coming back and renegotiating and cause the U.S. to win at their expense? I think that's the case in every one of these renegotiations. As we talked about NAFTA, is there going to be a NAFTA 2.0? More to learn, and my guess is our session in September will still be timely as we get to that point. So, as Tracy said, Why Invest in Economic Development 2.0 is out. You can download it. If you come to our Buffalo conference in June, I'm sure we will have copies there as well. People that are coming through Washington, I have spoken to a couple groups. Matt's spoken to a couple groups, and we're taking copies of this with us. It is a good talking point to provide to your mayors. It's a great talking point to help you with your congressional staff and your congressional delegations. It has new data points. It updates information on fiscal 2018 and 2019. And if you have a color printer, I would suggest when you download it to a color printer, because it is much better looking in color. And we hope to see you soon. I'm going to be on the road a little bit, but we have our Economic Future Forum, which is only getting better and better. It's going to be in Buffalo, June 24th to 26th. I'm also going to be in British Columbia in June as well, June 13th to 14th with Denny Coleman, one of our past chairs. And we're going to be teaching our Managing Economic Development course coming up. So as I've indicated, I hope many of you will be with us in our annual conference in Atlanta. So, Hong Fei, are there any questions that we have people have posted for us? And so far, we don't see any questions. I'm sure we have answered everything. Matt, why don't you share with us anything that I may have missed that you think people should focus on, and on what you're seeing on the Hill?
Well, you didn't miss anything. Not at all. It's an interesting period of time that we're in right now from a appropriations and budget standpoint, because in theory, rescissions aside, we have a Congress that is on paper in agreement on what they want as a spending plan for the next year. And so when we passed that budget deal in late January, early February, it set the top line number for fiscal 18 as well as fiscal 19, which is a key first step in the appropriations process. And so what we're seeing right now in the subcommittees are bills that are moving a little bit quicker than usual, which may be a good sign that we might actually be able to get appropriations done prior to the August recess and the midterm election campaigns really kicking into high gear. The other thing that I would point out on the trade side is Jeff mentioned we're going to have this session in Atlanta at our annual conference, and it's really sort of started to push its way up in terms of topics that we're hearing from folks that they're interested in learning more about. The big thing with trade negotiations that I always point out is that no matter what is negotiated, so all the things that we're hearing in the news about what the Canadians are saying or what the Mexicans are saying or what we are saying, at the end of the day, what gets presented to Congress is essentially a piece of legislation that they have to pass like any other piece of legislation, and that the president has to sign. So good or bad, the details of the trade negotiations shouldn't cause too much alarm because they still have to go through the final test of actually being able to pass Congress. And that's typically in the past been a good way for negotiators to keep things under wraps.
So one of the things I want to add is for those of you who have had any relationships with Select USA, many of you or many of your organizations may be coming to their summit in June here in Washington, D.C. But, and we have written a letter to the administration, not outlining all of our concerns, but we are watching Select USA, and we're actually worried that if they're hollowing out the staff of Select USA, which has been a pretty economic development friendly staff. They actually know how to use their partnerships with, knew how to use their partnerships with economic development organizations. And we're a little bit concerned that that the new political leadership don't understand it, don't know how to use economic developers, don't understand that at the end of the day, we're going to be helping them make deals work. And they're going to be going back to a pre-Select USA time, and I will help you recall what that was like. And my speeches before Select USA was, the United States is the only industrialized country in the world that does not have a federal foreign direct investment attraction entity. Select USA solved that, and they took teams of economic developers to various trade shows. They took them on country visits. They held the major summit, relied upon the partnership between Select USA and economic development organizations. And I worry that that may be slipping. As you are briefing your congressional delegation, whisper in their ear. I'm not sure there's a thing to do in terms of action yet, but whisper in their ear and tell them more to come at some point in the future. We will either come back to you and tell you it's not as bad as we think it is, or it is worse than we think it is, and it's time to pull out the guns and talk to our congressional delegations. Matt, any other thoughts?
We're still here in Washington, despite everything that you're reading. And I would like to say, particularly during National Economic Development Week, you know, how important it's been over the past several months as we've transitioned to a new administration, that you all have become engaged, have spoken with your elected officials and your staff contacts, and that the presence of the economic development profession here in Washington, the profile rather, has certainly benefited from that and increased.
Yeah, one of the interesting things, Matt almost has had a new job or a better job over the last several months, and that is, sure, we worked the Hill before, but I don't think we were as effective as we needed to be. We, on behalf of our members, we've hired an outside lobbying firm to assist us. We are engaged more directly with the Hill committees, where in the past we would be engaged more with the administration, and the prior administration was very pro-economic development, and I think maybe that was the difference. We're in more of a rear guard action, protecting economic development at this particular point in time. I don't see any more questions. I think we'll bring this to an end. I hope that you're doing something in your community this week to get your city council to issue a resolution, your Chamber of Commerce, you're holding a press event, you're doing something to help articulate what economic development is to your business leadership, your citizenry, your elected officials. This is a good week to do that. It gives us one opportunity, 1 week a year, over and above what you normally do, to bring attention on what you do as economic developers. We appreciate you being with us. Tracy, if you're still on here, thank you for kicking this off today, and have a nice week. Take care.